Now, our first witness this morning, as you know, is anonymous. He is witness W3044, and in his case, as in the case of others who have anonymity, I shall read out the order which applies in his case. I order that the name and address of witness W3044 and any other identifying information, such as the witness's image or a description of their appearance, cannot be disclosed or published in any form unless express permission is given by me or by the solicitor to the inquiry acting on my behalf. Witness W3044 must be referred to only as Mr. B.C. This order remains in force for the duration of the inquiry and at all times thereafter, unless otherwise ordered. And I may vary or revoke the order by making a further order during the course of the inquiry. So, Mr. B.C., Mary will now ask you to take the oath.
Mr. B.C., your full name is known to the inquiry. Could you please repeat after me? I do solemnly, sincerely.
I do solemnly, sincerely.
And truly declare and affirm.
And truly declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Mr. B.C., you have severe haemophilia A. Is that right?
Yes, I do.
And you were diagnosed at about age 3 after you broke your leg.
That's correct, yes.
And your care was then transferred to Cardiff under Professor Bloom.
Correct, yes.
You developed an inhibitor, and so you don't recall, I think, having any treatment apart from in 1975.
That's correct, yes.
And in 1975, you were admitted to hospital for some experimental treatment.
Yes.
What can you tell us about that?
I was led to believe that the treatment, I was possibly the first person in the UK to get it, and about probably the 10th in the world to get it. Apart from that, being aged about 6 at the time, my memory is obviously a little hazy. My guess would be, because I couldn't take factor VIII at the time, it was probably some kind of experimental bypassing agent. The treatment was successful in the sense that it kind of worked for reducing the bleed and the length of time that I had effectively to spend laid up. However, it had the very bizarre side effect that I literally forgot how to walk. I had only been in bed for 3 to 4 days, and I could not get up and put one foot in front of the other. And so that I only effectively had the treatment for the one bleed.
Your bleeding as a severe haemophiliac caused significant problems with your education.
Yes.
What can you tell us about your education up to the age of 11?
So my education up to the age of 11 was really very, very limited. Having had inhibitors, a typical bleed would last anywhere between, shall we say, 10 and 14 days. And then you would gradually start to remobilize, and then the process would repeat again. So age 6, I went to school for 3 days in the year. And then in the following year, I think I probably went for about 9 days. So behind the scenes, I was very, very fortunate in that to make up for, I guess, haemophilia, I was born kind of with a bit of a brain, really, and was quite kind of intelligent and interested as a kid. So the local kind of teaching authority initially brought in a private tutor for me for 2 hours a day. And that seemed to be going reasonably well, but everyone thought that that really wasn't enough. And of course, also, you weren't having the social interaction of children of the same age that was obviously so important to someone like me. So round about 78, it was beginning to be suggested that I might go to perhaps a school somewhere that would be able to take my condition and so on and so forth. There was one school I know that was possibly recommended in Bristol, but Prof Bloom didn't like that one very much, and so it was decided that I would board at Treloar's from 79.
And you said just a moment ago that Prof Bloom didn't particularly like the one at Bristol.
Yes.
How influential was he in having you go to Treloar's?
So I was born in a Welsh mountain valley town, really, and my parents were very kind of old-fashioned in some sense. They were very stoic. We never talked about anything important, and consequently, people in authority, teachers, doctors, were kind of like their word was, in some sense, kind of set. And so my mother in particular thought that, Prof Bloom was fantastic, and, he got me into this school and so on and so forth. So whatever he would have recommended, my parents would have said yes to, I think.
And you were at Treloar's until 1987, when you were age 18?
Yes, just shy of 18, yes.
And you've described Treloar's as transformational for you.
Yes, I mean, as a 6 to 9 year old child who never effectively left the house, to suddenly actually start interacting with other children of the same age, and of course who had the same condition as you, was kind of transformational, really. It was eye-opening. And I think I said in my statement, it was a very kind of can-do environment where, we can do that. So certainly my first several years at Treloar's were very kind of eye-opening and transforming.
When you arrived at Treloar's, you said in your statement that you didn't immediately receive treatment.
Yes.
When did you start treatment, as far as you know?
So, obviously, because of the inhibitors, I had high-level responding inhibitors, which meant that they only had a certain number of doses that they would be able to give me, so they had to be saved for very life-threatening bleeds. So I estimate that I had been in the school probably for about a year. So I would say something like late 80. The new set of inhibitor bypassing agents were coming onto the market. And in my statement, which was correct at the time, I have now managed to find some records. And there is evidence of a letter from Treloar's to Cardiff, or possibly Cardiff to Treloar's, I think, saying, yes, it was from Prof Bloom, saying I have no objections to him going on to Autoplex. And, in some sense, I can't remember the actual wording of the letter, but it said something like, we were very lucky to get one free dose, and we can't afford it, basically, so no problems.
We've got the letter from Dr. Arenstam to Professor Bloom, which predates the letter I think that you have, that unfortunately we don't have to display, but we can look at the letter from Dr. Arenstam, TREL 40167_016, please, Shumik. Thank you. We can see there the letters dated the 10th of July 1980 and the second substantive paragraph. I've had some very good results with Autoplex for knee and elbow bleeds in 2 of our lads with high response inhibitors. Neither of them have had anamnestic responses of any significance. I'd be very keen to treat his bleeds with this substance, particularly as we've had such good documentation of the behaviour of bleeds into his knees when treated with immobilisation alone. I wonder whether you would agree to this. And I think you've then seen the response.
I've seen the response,
that
yes.
Suggests Professor Bloom was
happy
content with that.
Yes.
In the summer of 1980, or it may have been the autumn of 1980, it's not entirely clear, were your parents aware of the Autoplex treatment to be given to you?
Again, I personally, my parents never spoke to me at all about this. So I initially would have said no, but scanning through my medical records, I think I have seen correspondence from Dr. Aramstam asking my parents whether they would want me to go on an Autoplex trial.
What we have in your records, and you can tell us whether this is what you've seen or whether it's something else, is TREL 40173_083. And it's a little bit later in time. 8th of December 1981.
Yes, I think that's the letter that I seem to have remembered, flicking through the 500 pages of medical notes.
See, this discusses weekly injections of factor 8 rather than
the Autoplex. Yes.
As far as you can recall, don't worry if you're not entirely sure, do you think there was another letter in relation to Autoplex or just this letter in relation to factor 8?
I honestly wouldn't know. Sorry, I'd have to go back and try and find that in the notes.
If we stay with this letter,
Yes.
December 1981, so sometime later,
Yes.
there is this letter to your parents saying this. There's recently been a lot of new hope for the treatment of inhibitors in haemophiliacs. Many workers in Europe now claim to be able to lower the level of inhibitors to factor 8 so that treatment for bleeding can be given as easily as if inhibitors were not present. I wonder whether you would agree to my using one of the newer methods on him in an attempt to reduce the way his inhibitor resists to treatment. It would then be possible to give him some very active physiotherapy for his knee and hopefully a better quality of life. The method would involve weekly injections of factor 8 and the taking of several blood samples at various intervals. I have, of course, spoken to Professor Bloom about this, and any use of such methods would, of course, be a combined operation. It appears after this letter, looking at your records, that you then did undergo a course of immune tolerance treatment in 1982.
Yes.
After the Autoplex.
Yes, I think the idea was that with the Autoplex and the fibre and the porcine, which I tried, and the probably factor 9 that I would have tried, because I then had some backup, they could then go with the immune tolerance. They had alternative kind of treatments to give me.
And we can see that on TREL 40173_019, please. It's a pupil review sheet, and we can see at the bottom that it's dated the 23rd of November 1983, and it indicates that you were doing very well, no bleeds so far this term, has been on the tolerance-inducing protocol since April 1982, and that this had converted you from a high responder to a low responder. If we just pause there, other than the letter to your parents in relation to the factor 8, do you recall any discussion at all about any risks involved in undergoing this treatment?
No.
And while we've got this document here, if we could just zoom out again, we can see a note above the handwriting: parental involvement in medical care, yes. we've obviously seen the letter in 1981. Are you aware of any other involvement of your parents in relation to your care?
No.
In relation to how often you received that factor 8 tolerance-inducing protocol, could we have TREL 40173 underscore 004, please? Page 23 of that document. We have a page of what the inquiry has seen in relation to another witness appeared to be a equivalent to the school report that would go home, and one of the pages was the medical page. Do you recall having anything like that to take home?
Yes, and scouting through my medical records, I have found forms that effectively were treatment forms that on holiday periods, for example, I had to fill in. So I have, on the 27th of the 10th, 1983, given 6 bottles of HP ... and so on and so forth.
I think we're slightly cross purposes, apologies. In terms of a school report, as in one page would be about English, one page would be about maths.
Oh, yes, sorry.
And then at the back there'd be a page about medical or physiotherapy.
Yeah.
Do you recall anything like that going home? Or taking it home at the end of term?
I recall a school report, and as you said, obviously English, maths and science were definitely there. I think there probably was a short sentence or two from the medical centre, yes.
And that perhaps might look like this as the back page of the school report?
Yes, yes.
So we have this from November 1982, and we can see that at that point you were doing very well on the programme of 3 weekly transfusions with factor 8 concentrate, aiming at neutralising his inhibitor level. So in November 82, it seems you were receiving 3 weekly transfusions.
Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Blood taken on a Monday.
I just want to have a look at some other of your records to explore the products that you were receiving, particularly in 1983. Could we have TREL 40170 underscore 018, please? And could we start at page 9, please? Thank you. So we can see on the top left the date 6th of February 1983, and then if we go down to units material, we can see there you were given Interhem. And then if we go to page 7, 12th of February 1983, and Interhem again. And then if we go to page 1, 5th of March 1983, high potency factor 8. And then page 11, we have a series of entries across the 17th and 18th of May, high potency factor 8, fever, autoplex. Does that accord with your recollection of the different products you received, or at the time were you unaware of what you were receiving?
Yes, that does. Yeah, that strikes a chord. Yes.
And was there ever any discussion about the types of products you would receive?
No, not really.
You continued to receive the regular factor VIII to try and reduce your inhibitors.
Yes.
And if we again go to another couple of records, TREL 40173 underscore 004, please, page 30. We can see in the bottom right corner another of those medical reports, and we can see that it's dated the 19th of June 1983. To neutralise his inhibitor level, his programme was stepped up to daily transfusions with factor VIII instead of the previous 3 weekly transfusions. Does that accord with your recollection of?
No, I don't remember going to daily prophylaxis. No.
Do you positively remember that you didn't, or do you just
Oh,
not
no,
recall?
definitely not. I just can't recall.
Can't recall.
No, I mean, obviously you were having a lot of injections, and for whatever reason you were part of the Autoplex trial, you were part of the porcine trial, you were part of this, you were going up having blood taken for various levels, you were having treatment which may or may not have worked, so you were having another treatment. So that could absolutely be true, but I cannot honestly remember or recall going on daily prophylaxis.
This seems to have happened at some point in the summer of 1983.
Mm-hmm.
And if we go to the next page of the records, we have a note dated the 22nd of June 1983 with the heading AIDS. I'm going to just read it out because the writing's very difficult to read, and I think I've
doctors, what do you expect?
interpreted what it says. Temperature 36.1. No sign of temperature for more than a week in the past. No throat.
No rise.
Sorry, no rise. I failed at the first hurdle, sir. Apologies. No rise in temperature for the for more than a week in the past. No throat pains or difficulty in swallowing for more than a week in the past. No shortness, and I think it probably means no shortness of breath for more than 1 week in the past. No diarrhea for more than a week in the past. Then there's a star, cough for more than, I think it's 2 weeks in the past. Yes, but can't remember when. Certainly not during the past 3 months. This is contrary to what he told us on the 28th of February 1983. Lymph nodes, very small lymph node on the left axilla, same finding as the 28th of February 1983. No loss of weight. The star says same findings as on 28 February 1983.
It's difficult to interpret the, certainly not contrary to what he told us on the 28th of February 1983, which is more than 3 months before the 22nd of June.
It is.
So what is contrary, one wonders?
One does wonder, and we can go there if it would be assistance, sir, but there is no record that I can see in the clinical notes of anything on the 28th of February 1983. Perhaps it would be useful to see that, sir. It's page 28 of this document, Shoemik. At the top, we have what appears to be either the 9th or the 1st of February 1983, and then a record of the 13th of March 83.
Yes.
And the records do appear to be chronological, with nothing particularly out of place.
Are these simply orthopaedic notes, however?
That's been flagged orthopaedic, but if one continues down through that page, it's physio as well, and it's also general clinical notes.
Where are the general clinical notes?
If one carries on down, so if one carries on down, one can see a note that includes physio at the bottom, and then the next page is spring term assessment, bleeds, haematology, biochemistry. So it may be that we're missing something.
Yes, that certainly looks more general.
And similarly, if we go back a page, we also see haematology notes and references to having contacted Professor Bloom about bleeds. So it's obviously unclear, sir, exactly whether the notes are one set of notes or whether there are other documents that are missing. But what we have available to us, we've not been able to identify a note in relation to the 28th of February 1983.
Yes.
In June 1983, when we have this note headed AIDS, were you aware of them undertaking any what might be termed AIDS-related investigations on you?
No, definitely not.
And then if we can carry on in those notes to page 37 of the same document. Sorry, TREL. Oh, you're there. Thank you, Jimmick. At the top of the page, we've got entries for February 84 and March 84, where lymph nodes have been checked. And then the 2nd of March 84, it simply says lymphocyte antibodies to Dr. Smith, with no further detail. Were you aware of any tests being sent out of Treloar's to anyone particular?
No.
And I just want to finish dealing with the tolerance-inducing protocol. If we pick up in the same document, please, page 46. In fact, sorry, Shimmick, if we could start on page 47. We can see a note which deals with tolerance-inducing protocol. A little bit further down, please. Thank you. Started 26th April 1982 on 920 units at AD, high potency, armour factor 8. See opposite pages for batch numbers, so we'll come to that in a moment. Temporarily stopped after the dose on the 28th of March 1984 until further notice. Then if we go back a page to see the batch numbers, page 46, please. We see the entry is on what appears to be the 4th of April 1984, spring term assessments, and we go down to the heading in the middle, please, material batch numbers related to pyrexial, I think it says episodes.
Episode, yeah.
It says prophylaxis 8th of January 84 to 23rd of January 84, and it gives a batch number for high purity factor 8, and then a series of batch numbers, and that it was high purity factor 8 or ordinary factor 9, and then it says tolerance inducing protocol stopped after the dose. Do you recall why the tolerance inducing protocol was stopped with you in March 84.
I didn't, but again, scanning through my medical records, I found a couple of correspondence, again, between Treloar's and Prof. Bloom. Basically, I had a probably week or a fortnight of pyraxia or spiraling temperatures, where my temperature would suddenly go up to 41 degrees. And that's when they decided to stop the factor 8 immune tolerance. For what reason, not automatically clear. Whether I was seroconverting, whether I was being exposed to Hep C, we don't know. I stopped the treatment, and I would guess approximately after about 2 to 3 weeks, certainly I was back to normal, shall we say. The temperature had disappeared, and I felt kind of like fine, really.
And again, do you, or from discussions with your parents, does there anyone have any recollection of a discussion at that time about high temperatures and needing to stop the protocol?
No. Unfortunately, high temperatures in the school were reasonably common. I mean, if you put 200 kids together, you know what you're like. You know, you get chickenpox parties and this, that, and the other. So if somebody got quite a bad chest infection, it would go through the school. And shall we say, perhaps, how to say this nicely, the general health of the individuals at the school wasn't as good as the general population. So those chest infections all became quite serious. And so it wasn't unknown for people to, be in medical centre with, sounding like a rhinoceros trying to cough, basically. So
I just want to look at one last record before asking you some more general questions. If we could have TREL 40173_061, please. This is a letter from the 12th of June 1984 from Dr. Wassif to a doctor in the Netherlands, where you were due to be going on holiday.
yes.
And we can see here that Dr. Wassif has written that your inhibitor level varies between 7 and 11 new Oxford units. We've been treating him with 50 units per kilogram body weight of either factor 9, fever, or autoplex. For life-threatening bleeds or for bleeds not responding to the above measures, we've treated him with massive doses of ARMA high-potency factor 8. So is that also your recollection that during certainly 84,
Yes.
that was the treatment, you were having massive doses of
Yes.
high-potency ARMA?
Yes, I stopped the immune tolerance in approximately March 84. But I continued to have ARMA products, I would say, for probably about 7 further months, I would think. And again, going back to my medical records that you may have got, it'll probably be the next slide, I'm probably preempting. But I certainly have seen correspondence that I have had large doses of ARMA for an ankle bleed in October of 84, which they flagged as suspicious because they thought I was putting it on, I think, in the nicest sense of the word. Interestingly, at the bottom of that letter, which was a letter to Prof. Bloom, it says, P.S. we have recently gone on to high purity. And the letter was dated, I think, from memory, something like mid-December. And the P.S. was something like, for all those on commercial factor 8, we have gone on to high. We have moved them on to heat treated. For those on list are currently unaffected, as you were.
I'm afraid so. I don't think we have that to display today, but I can make sure that it's available at a subsequent point. You recall in your statement that Dr. Dasani rotated to Treloar's as a doctor
Yes.
for a period. Is that right?
Correct, yes.
And you've discussed his view of the treatment that was being given. What was it?
I do actually have a photocopy of the letter, if you can possibly read it at the very bottom, but it's entirely up to
I don't know if it'd be useful if I read it out.
if you can possibly read it. It's, sorry,
I'm,
the files...
just need to make sure we just need to make sure that the camera doesn't follow me. And I will disappear
Well,
from the front.
Mary, perhaps you can correct it.
I apologise in advance.
Sorry.
I was quite late in going through these documents, and they were all sent in a massive zip file, so I couldn't even save them or drop them into a letter. So it ended up with me doing the high-tech thing of taking pictures of them on the phone. It's the PS, Sarah, right at the bottom of that first page, I think, that I've turned over. There's 3 lines right at the bottom.
Oh gosh.
I-
I think it reads, P.S. Lately we have changed to heat-treated factor at 8. I'm afraid I'm struggling to read the rest. It appears to read something along the lines of for patients who were receiving commercial factor 8, those who were on Lister factor is unchanged, but I would want to double check exactly what that said.
Well, it appears on the face of it to be saying that those who had been having commercial concentrate would now get heat-treated commercial concentrate. Those who had been having NHS
Yes.
product would continue on NHS product.
That's the sense of what I can read, sir, and it's dated the 17th of December 1984.
It rather assumes that people were having just the one form of treatment,
Indeed.
at least so far as NHS was concerned, but no distinction made with the word commercial.
Precisely.
If it's absolutely important to you, I do have it on my phone, which is much clearer.
We can pick it up at another point. Thank you.
We just have to be very careful given you're anonymous.
No problems.
Dr. Dasani,
Oh, sorry, yes.
he, you said, rotated to Treloar's
He did, yes.
for a period, and you've suggested that you were aware of his view of the treatment that was being given.
Yes.
What was that?
Dr. Dasani and I had quite a strong relationship, really. He subsequently moved to Cardiff Haemophilia Centre, which is where I was based. And so we had a very strong relationship. And in 2000s, we did kind of quite a lot of touring, giving medical talks about hepatitis C and the treatment that I was receiving then. So it was during those times, you know, when you were driving up and down the country on the M5 to give talks, that you gradually talked about old times and nostalgia. And he was quite, having just trained and come from Oxford, I think it was, he was quite shocked at the number of different batches that were being offered to the people, or the haemophiliacs at Treloar's. And he said that he had mentioned that perhaps they should cut down the exposure and give only certain batches to certain, students to minimise their risk. He did hint in a kind of roundabout way as well that he thought that they shouldn't have been... Sorry, I have to pick my words carefully here. I think the armour product was generally considered as dirty. And he was quite surprised that they were still using that one in, let's say, 1984. That would be my general view.
And did he talk specifically about the armour issue, or is that something you're inferring?
He did talk directly about the armour product, yes.
Because, of course, from what we've seen, you were receiving huge
The armour.
doses of
Yes.
high-potency armour.
Yes.
You were infected with both HIV and hepatitis C.
Yes.
And I want to just pick up in relation to the HIV to start with. Could we turn to TREL 40173 underscore 004, please, page 52. We have an entry for the 19th of March at 1985, and we've got a note of virology, and we see anti-HTLV3 positive on 11 January 84. And this picks up something of the strange wording that has been found in several witnesses' notes. And if I can then turn to TREL 400173_051. We've got the second paragraph down. It's a letter of the 22nd of March 1985. He was anti-HBC and anti-HBS negative on 19th of September 84 and was tested for anti-HTLV3 for the first time on 11th of January 1984 and was found to be positive. Given what appears to be the case in relation to when the HTLV3 test was available, it would appear that the 11th of January 84 would have been a retrospective test. We've got a note of both...
Sorry, when you say retrospective test, does that mean that in some sense samples had been stored, blood samples of mine had been stored and then tested at a later date?
That's what our current understanding it would be, and that was actually a question I wanted to ask you about.
So,
were you aware
no.
of any samples being stored?
No.
We've obviously got the medical record on the 19th of March, and this letter on the 22nd of March, 1985. What's your recollection of how and when and what you were told about your diagnosis?
Sorry, can I just, before I answer that question, bring me back to that because I'll go off on a wild goose chase. That does kind of explain a lot because obviously the 11th of the 1st the 11th of the 1st 84 is a long way from the date of this letter, which was March 85. Mm-hmm. So obviously if they had stored blood, then that would have kind of like made sense.
If I can just help on this, the conclusion to which at the moment I feel I should be bound to come is that there could not have been any testing for HIV or HTLV3 as it was then known as such at a date prior to the scientific world being told that there was such a thing as HTLV3. Mm-hmm. If you don't know it's there, if there isn't a test for it, you can't test for it. But once the test became available, which was later in 1984, then it would be possible to use such a test to backtest any stored samples. Mm-hmm. That's why at the moment Council suggests that this is what must have been happening. Yeah. It's highly unlikely that we would not have heard of a test actually being used prior to the discovery of the virus or the identification of the virus by that name.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So, but understandably, the wording of this letter, which we've seen in a number of people's medical records, is very strange. And I'm conscious that for many people it's been very confusing. But it does appear to be related to retrospective testing.
If we just go back to the 004.
Page 52.
The note there is entirely consistent with both.
Absolutely.
And so it may be, this is just pure supposition for anyone to comment on in due course. It's not a conclusion. It couldn't be. But it might be that someone reading those notes or such notes would have said it was tested positive then for that's the first record we've got, in effect.
Precisely.
Because that note doesn't say there was an actual test conducted. Indeed, there wouldn't be any point, really, in recording it on the 19th of March 1985 if there was already a record earlier in the notes that it had been done on the 11th of January 84.
Absolutely, sir.
I suppose as well, just a point of interest in that the whole idea of HTLV3 was coming out in late 84 and so on and so forth. But from memory, there were some kind of guidelines, I think, about how to reduce exposure from either some clinical body like NICE or something like that, particularly of, I hate to use the word dirty products, but there we go. Obviously, I'm still receiving armour in October '84. And of course, I don't know the timelines of when those diktats were issued by the health department or whomever it might have been.
Just in terms of your diagnosis,
Sorry.
What's your recollection of how you were told, when you were told? What can you tell us about that?
It's interesting, isn't it, in that some people, that is the thing that they will remember the most. And for me, I think my mind has completely blocked it out. It's just a box that does not want to be opened. So when I was told, I could not honestly tell you. If you had to push me to it, I would guess 85. When, I have no idea. I have very little recollection of the day, apart from going up and being told with someone who you're going to speak to quite soon, and we went up effectively together to the medical centre. And I cannot remember whether we were told together or whether we were told individually. I think some boys were told together, but I wouldn't swear on that. I think I was told individually. And it was very much, I don't really remember much after that, whether some shock or kind of, oh wow, it kicked in. And I think I don't remember asking very many questions about it, about what it meant. Kind of, I think I was probably in too much of a shock. But I cannot recall being offered any form of counselling at all. And Treloar's, in some sense, was a great environment, but of course it also had a lot of severely ill people with diseases that meant their life expectancy was 20. So death did kind of stalk around the corridors quite a lot. And obviously when you were young, your cohort weren't really subjected to it, but as you got towards the finishing line and you were 16, 17 and 18, then your friends started going. So there was never a counsellor, and nothing like that was really ever spoken about. And of course you're giving effectively a terminal diagnosis to a teenager. Really. And I know hindsight's a beautiful thing, and we now sat in 2020 and we're all a bit more aware of mental health than we were back in 1985. But surely that doesn't kind of sound quite right, really, does it?
And at that time, what was your understanding of AIDS?
I was going to be dead within 2 to 3 years.
Had you been given any information prior to the diagnosis?
Not really, only the stuff that you'd picked up via osmosis from the paper or from television or something like that. And being kind of reasonably intelligent and on the ball and so on and so forth, you kind of like knew, really. You kind of knew.
Were your parents told about your diagnosis?
I would not be able to answer that question, no.
And have you ever been able to talk to them about it?
No, is the honest answer. And it's very interesting, isn't it? If you were told you were going to die in 3 years' time of a disease, there would be effectively an outpouring of love and sympathy and care for you as an individual. But in 1985, you were told that you probably were going to die in 2 years. And in some sense, the government had set up an environment which ostracized us and basically made us scared, or made the general population scared of us. So rather than receiving any kind of support and help and anything like that, we were effectively left to go and die with our families in houses behind locked doors. And that is something I think that, is very difficult, really.
And it's a conversation you've never had with your parents?
It would, if I'd have said to them, Dad, look, I've got, liver cancer or something like that. Oh, okay, we could have had a conversation about it. We've had conversations about haemophilia and about how it's going to affect you. But no, you couldn't talk about HIV. And part of that, of course, was growing up in a Welsh Valleys mountain town, right, where everybody knew everybody else's business, so you did not. And it was only in very late conversations with my dad, who is now, effectively on the last leg, and has kind of been more amenable, shall I say, to having any form of talk with him, that you discovered that my parents did have some kind of, words said to them in the village, basically.
Did your diagnosis change your attitude to treatment for haemophilia at all?
No, I don't think so. As I've said in the notes, I think certainly some of the friends or haemophiliacs that attended the Alton Haemophilia Centre, as it was then, they decided that they never wanted more treatment because they thought a double dose would be worse. Whereas for me, it was kind of like, well, it's a virus. As soon as you've got it, you've got it. So treatment-wise, no.
And as I said, you've also been infected with hepatitis C.
Yes.
What can you tell us about that diagnosis, when you were told and what you were told of it?
Again, absolutely nothing. That's another completely blocked out kind of event in my life.
In terms of what happened after you left Treloar's, you obtained a degree in maths, and you were offered the opportunity to train as an actuary, I
Yes.
think, initially.
Correct.
And you decided not to take up that place.
Correct.
Why was that?
Okay, so that's in some sense in 1982 in 1992, when I was offered the government actuarial position, or a government actuarial position, not the government actuarial position, things hadn't really changed very much. We were still expected to kind of like die within 2 or 3 years. And you kind of like thought, well, if I am going to die, I kind of like don't really want to expose, let's say, I'm quite altruistic, really. If people are going to start to kind of like train me and put money in to kind of like, train me for a profession, and suddenly I die on them, I kind of like think that that was not really worthwhile for them. And additionally, there would have been kind of stress involved. I was having days where at that stage I wasn't brilliant. Obviously, the haemophilia at that was being relatively well controlled, but there were good days and there were bad days. And you thought, well, I'm not altogether sure I'm going to be able to train as an actuary now. So deciding to go into education seemed in some sense a safer bet, to continue on with education, because that would be, the ball would be much more in my court. If I studied to do a PhD and I couldn't go into do the research on a Monday, then that's fine, I'll make up for it tomorrow type scenario. But having this regular kind of going into work 9 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, that was something that I thought I would not be able to do. So HIV was already in some sense beginning to affect my life choices, from which university I went to. Certainly at Treloar's, there were lots of people who thought I would go to Oxbridge. But again, the pressure and the additional stress, and the fact that if I got ill, my parents would want to come and see me. So that kind of dictated which university I went to. And HIV also effectively dictated which profession I kind of like went into.
And so you obtained your PhD.
I did.
And stayed in academia for a number of years.
Yes.
And I think you've described that choice was about the flexibility that it gave you.
Yes, academia in some sense is is a land of kooks, really. If you're an oddball in academia, no one really bats an eyelid. If you're not in for a day or two, no one bats an eyelid. And effectively, if you're working for yourself on a research project, as I've said, it doesn't matter if you miss a day, you catch up the following day. Or you set the computer program to run overnight and come back 2 days later and see what results you've got.
In terms of your personal relationships, what effect did your infections have on having personal relationships?
That's a very interesting question. I was quite late to kind of find myself sexually, really. And I think perhaps HIV may have been kind of, in some cases, to blame about that, because you're 15 years old, you're just kind of working your way out, and then all of a sudden crikey, you've got this kind of, life-threatening disease, so you don't begin to think about it, and so you put it off, and you live a bit longer, and so on and so forth. But when it actually came to relationships, that was really quite challenging for me as an individual, because in some sense, we, as haemophiliacs who'd been infected in 84 and 85, had been conditioned to lie by the social environment at the time. And I'm sure most people in this room, if I say the word iceberg, they'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So the hysteria that the government created and basically meant that we were ostracized. And it didn't really seem right, really, if you look at kind of what's happening in COVID today and what happened then. People with it today get a lot of kind of like help and protection, and their families are looked after, and you're given financial assistance and this and that and the other. Whereas in 1985, you were basically ignored. Your voices were not heard. And when that came to relationships, that caused a massive problem in trust. Balancing that trust. I mean, if I started, thought about dating you, for example, in 95, when do I disclose my HIV status? If I disclose it on the first date, you're going to think, oh my God, I might never see you again. Alternatively, if I wait a bit, your response might be, do you not trust me? Why didn't you tell me before? So it was a very kind of like, very difficult kind of balance. And the stigma associated with it was very challenging. And I think the stigma associated with the iceberg and the government's response to it in 1985 was such that the people who actually wanted to say something couldn't, because they'd been scared into silence. They didn't really have a voice when it came for compensation or anything like that, because society meant that they would be badly kind of affected or subject to discrimination. So it wasn't effectively until I finally discovered that I kind of like preferred boys rather than girls, that everything kind of fitted and made a lot more sense. And in some sense, for me personally, that meant that it was much easier, because I was looking for a partner in a group of people who had experienced very, very similar things to the haemophiliacs. The gay community had got absolutely, forgive the pun, bashed in the 90s. So, in some sense, HIV was not so much of a problem, really. So I'm very lucky to have found a partner who kind of puts up with my mental health issues and my, all the issues that I've parked for 25 years ago that suddenly have mounted up and so on and so forth.
And what can you tell us about your health until about 2000? Then we'll pick up what's happened since then.
Generally quite good. I was very fortunate in that I didn't have any kind of AIDS-related diseases or symptoms, apart from very minor things like shingles and some kind of rash on my skin, which was very, pro-HIV or indicative. I seem to remember at the time I was quite late in starting AZT. The protocol at the time was to wait until your CD4 count dropped below 200 before starting. So I was quite late starting that, I think. And you were given additional things like Cetrin for pneumonia, which was a risk, which was probably, one of the big side effects. And then the drugs obviously created huge side effects, the AZT and the stavudine, causing the lipodystrophy and the concurrent problems with fats and the way that they're distributed in the body and how much cake you can eat and all things like that. So up until about 2000, I would say I was reasonably kind of like okay. And then, unfortunately, of course, the hepatitis started to become a bit more of an issue. And I don't know what it was like for other people, but hepatitis was much more insidious, really, because you felt kind of 99.99% as well as you did yesterday. And it's only after several years that those 0.01% start to build up. And it's not until you think, actually, how far down have I actually fallen here? And you look up and you think, oh, crikey, I'm quite a long way down here. So it had gotten to the stage where Cardiff were considering doing kind of liver biopsies for cirrhosis and things like that. And they then decided to have a go with the interferon in about 2000, 2001.
You underwent treatment with interferon ribavirin.
Yes.
I think a third drug was added in.
I think I was on a trial for third drug, and I seem to remember it being called amantadine, which was kind of like an anti-flu drug, and they were seeing if that had any kind of effect at all. I had an amenable genotype, I think is the word, which meant that the hepatitis was, it was a high probability of it being cured or shifted.
But in that first round of treatment, you didn't clear the virus.
Correct, I did not.
And so what was your response to that? What did you then do?
I think looking back on it, that's when things started to go south in a kind of mental kind of way, really. After the interferon, and I'm sure due to the increase in hepatitis, I was not in a brain fog all the time, but I didn't quite have the mental capacity that I did used to have. And that kind of was a worry, really. And so you are back to kind of thinking, okay, I've got another 2 years to go. It's almost like having a loyalty card with death, have 5 close encounters and get the ultimate one for free type scenario. Do you know what I mean? It was kind of, oh, well, okay, well, we've lasted a decade longer than, an awful lot of people. So that was a pretty good show. Let's kind of carry on. So I basically thought, well, if I've only got a year or two to go, may as well make the most of it. So I kind of didn't take on another research project. I went around the world for a year. I thought, well, this is it. And Cardiff wanted 6 months. I wanted a year. They wanted 9 months. I said, they wanted 8 months. I said, can we go for 9? And so that was it.
And when you returned to the UK, you then had further treatment with pegylated interferon and ribavirin.
Correct, yes.
And what can you tell us about that, the side effects of it?
The side effects, so going back to Dr. Dasani from a previous conversation, around about this time also we were starting to do some kind of tours around the country with another individual who also went through similar treatments to me. Now, on his first go of interferon, he could not get out of bed for 6 months and cleared it. I alternatively, yes, I felt a bit rough on kind of injection days. But after that, I was generally okay. I'd have to possibly take it quiet for kind of, imagine having a COVID vaccination, that type of thing these days. For the second batch of treatment, the interferon, the pegylated interferon, The side effects, the physical side effects were much better because it was effectively a slow-release substance. You didn't get these huge spikes in concentration of the drug that the body had trouble handling and therefore reacted to. So consequently, it was much more physically easier to handle. The only problem is, of course, the active ingredient is in your body for longer. So as a result, it's doing its thing for longer. So I was borderline kind of neutropenic. So my white blood cells were really getting quite hammered and bashed, really. So, but we managed to avoid any kind of additional transfusions of
So needing platelet. You didn't need anything like platelets or any additional
white blood cells.
support.
Correct. No.
And in terms of your physical, sorry, I should say that treatment cleared the
Yes, it did.
hepatitis C at that point.
Yes, it did.
In terms of your physical health since that treatment, what's your physical health been like?
I would say generally pretty stable, but as in with most haemophiliacs, a gradual decline in kind of mobility and joint functions and so on and so forth like that.
And I think you've described that you feel that you're mentally less sharp than you used to be.
Yes, I mean, when I came back from my round-the-world trip, really, I thought, I just cannot do academia anymore. I just cannot. And that made finding employment really quite challenging because, you know, the avenue of what I really always wanted to do, you know, to become an actuary, because numbers were meat and drink to me. They just talked to me like, you know, it was easy. And so academic, yes, I would have been a passable academic, but I wasn't going to, you know, rewrite the world. And with the mental fog and the depression that effectively started then. And we all probably have some insight into depression about how it's an ever kind of diminishing circle that you feel unhappy, so you feel so more depressed. And some people turn to props, shall we say, to help them. I never really felt the need to do that. But actually, it was a long time before I actually admitted that mental health was an issue and that I was really starting to struggle then. It's, you know, that stoic mentality, don't talk to anybody about this type thing.
You described earlier that you'd parked a lot at
Yes.
what had happened.
Yes.
And I think in your statement you talk that's really come back to impact you in your mental health now.
Yes, definitely.
What can you tell us about that?
So obviously, things that you had parked that you never really gave credence for. So, for example, something that I really wondered whether it actually existed, it's survivor guilt. You know, why me? Why was I the lucky one that, in some sense, survived, whereas, and I could name, 20 names here that didn't. That doesn't kind of why? So that obviously was an issue. I think obviously the diagnosis of HIV, the unfairness of it, and in some sense, I think anger at the way we were treated really in the 80s. This, ostracization of us, that really wasn't fair and very, very inhumane, really. So all of these issues started to come up. Along with, a sense of worthlessness, a sense of, you really feeling that you could have contributed to society in some way instead of just, sitting at home trying to shoot zombies on the PlayStation. So that's been a real challenge for me, particularly somebody with an active, a hyperactive mind who just thinks all the time, or tries to think all the time and achieves nothing.
Because in terms of work, since you've had the hepatitis C treatment and the depression,
yes,
have you been able to work in any?
Not really, no. I have tried occasionally, but again, a friend had a finance company. I tried to work for him, and I just couldn't. I just didn't have it anymore. Couldn't write the computer programs. Couldn't kind of do things like that anymore. And of course, that all adds into the self, the lack of self-worth, and should I really be here, and what's the point of it all, and things like that, really.
I want to pick up a final topic with you. It's related. I just want to talk with you a little bit about your interactions with the trusts and schemes.
Mm-hmm.
You received payments from the Macfarlane Trust and from the Skipton Fund.
Yes.
What was your experience of dealing with the Macfarlane Trust?
I'm going to put my statistical head on here for a moment. I'm absolutely sure that you will have heard a lot of testimony about the Macfarlane Trust and about the Haemophilia Society. And as part of statistics, one of your jobs is to what's called do a meta-analysis. In other words, take all of the available data and take a step backwards and try to see the whole picture, really. And I think it's only human that you get annoyed at the public face of the company. So if your train is late or, the barrier's shut, you start having a go at the poor old lady at the ticket barrier. And it's not her fault that you were 30 seconds late. But that's who you rant at. If your router fails and you ring up and are kept on this endless kind of mindless telephone system for hours before you actually get to somebody, it's not their fault. What you really want to do is you want to complain to somebody a bit higher up and say, look, you need to get your system sorted out. So trying to take a step backwards and trying to kind of see a bigger picture. Like everyone else, my experience with the Macfarlane Trust was not great. And it has caused, A, a lot of mental health issues, and B, a lot of annoyance. So the other half rolls his eyes, for example, if I mention the Macfarlane Trust. He goes, oh, God, he's going on his hobby horse again. Shut him up, for God's sake. But if I was to take a step backwards, I think what I would say is that fundamentally, I think the Macfarlane Trust was set up incorrectly. It was set up incorrectly by the government. And I think it ended up that we were just we became reliant on them in some sense to survive. We had to be almost subservient to them in order to survive. We had to, kind of go a-begging for money and this, that, and the other. And that does not seem right to me for a charitable organisation. Now, whether the government kind of deliberately did that or not is open to question that others will have to answer. But the government, never accepted any responsibility for what happened. The fact that they allowed dirty blood products into the country, and then when people were affected, they effectively ostracized them and gave them very little or no help at all. And yet all of a sudden, here is an organization set up as the front piece of the government, and we should be grateful to them. That seems very odd to me. So, again, whether it was by intention or whether that's the way that it just panned out, I don't know. To do something probably that's going to be quite unpopular with the haemophiliacs in the room, I just want to take the Macfarlane Trust side just for a minute. Because it had a pretty big heavyweight in the opposite corner, the British government at the time, the Thatcher government at the time, or the remnants of the Thatcher government at the time, that many people, regardless of what you thought of their policies, as far as a well-run government was concerned, that managed to do things, it was pretty good. It did what it said on the tin, really. So, given the fact that they and the Haemophilia Society had such an overwhelming opponent, you now have to make a call as to your way forwards. what do you do to try and benefit the people the most that you're trying to represent against effectively a massive steamroller? So it was, and I could wax lyrical about, the unfairness, the postcode lottery. Why were people in this postcode paid more than people in that postcode? I could go on until the cows come home. But ultimately, I just feel a lot of anger, and you want to feel it towards the Macfarlane Trust, and you want to feel it towards, in some sense, the Haemophilia Society for not representing you well enough. But actually, I think, as I think about it more in my brain fog, I kind of blame the government increasingly more for setting up this completely bonkers scheme. Let's be honest. That just made little sense. The government failed to protect us against HIV and then failed to respond when we got it and wanted help, really. So that's what I would say about the Macfarlane Trust without going into a 5-hour discourse.
Mr. VC, they're the questions I have for you. I'm just going to turn and see if there's anything else. There's nothing further from behind me.
Well, you've described yourself as having an active, hyperactive mind, worked in academia, and a desire to see the whole picture. To what do you, reflecting, as you obviously do, on everything that has happened and trying to see why and how it happened, what would you say were the principal reasons that you suffered from HIV infection and hepatitis C infection?
It's a difficult question because obviously you don't know the facts. But I think that the government in 83 and 84 should have been a lot more proactive. They should have protected us a lot more than they did. I think without any evidence, I think they knew that this blood caused some problems and they didn't act quickly enough to stop it. Why? That's an interesting question, and one that I do not have an answer for. Whether it was ignorance, whether it was financial, whether it was, I'm going to be really harsh here, and this is outside the remit of the inquiry, but whether it was because it was only the bleeders and the queers who were being affected, so it didn't really matter. If it had been the general population, or a disease that was affecting the general population, would their actions have been the same? I don't honestly know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you think of anything that, in terms more closely related to your treatment, though you answered the question I asked you, that you would have done differently, even within the scope of the government's failures as you've just
I think
expressed them?
having had the experience of having had a decade where I had no treatment at all, I am certainly not unique, but I, am quite rare in knowing what not having factor VIII felt like. So if I had been told, look, if we carried on giving you this treatment, it has these risks associated with it, what would you like us to do? I could quite imagine myself at the day saying, I don't want to take that risk at this precise moment in time. I would go back to not having any treatment at all. Obviously in 1983, there were effectively backup treatments for me. that in some sense were considered safer than the armour product that I was being hammered with. So there could have been a compromise to say, right, I don't want the armour product anymore, but I might take the fibre because that's a European product and that in some sense is cleaner. So like everything, knowledge is power, isn't it? It empowers the individual to make a choice. And I felt that we never really had that information. We were never given it. And so that choice effectively was taken away from us.
Thank you very much for that.
I'm sorry. Sorry, I've been asked to raise a question from another legal representative.
Absolutely.
When did you first become aware that of your T cell values and why they were being recorded?
Ooh. I cannot give an honest answer to that, or an accurate answer to that, I should say. I'll give you an honest one. I would say, as a guess, I was not aware of my T cells being important in Treloar's. So it would have been after I left Treloar. So that would have been back under Cardiff's regimen, I would think. So that would have been probably somewhere in the region of 1990.
Is there anything else you would like to add?
I don't think so. I think I've hopefully explained everything as best as I possibly can through the brain fog. But there we go.
Well,
Thank you.
I have to say the brain fog is not apparent.
Thank you.
Nor is in particular, but perhaps this is because of the practice that you've had, is the iceberg particularly obvious. You may have shown us some of what's beneath
Yes.
the surface, and I'd just like to thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
And for what is, again, a different individual approach is the value of listening to different witnesses with different backgrounds. We take a rather more reflective view, born of academia and your interest in statistics, than others might. You've spoken in particular very powerfully about the stigma and the problems that have come mentally with coming to terms with what you've had to face. And unusually, perhaps, you can't precisely recall the conversations in which you heard the dreaded news.
Exactly. It's very odd that the way the brain works, isn't it? And I would just like to thank the inquiry, really, for a decade of, for like 30 years of people not really being interested in what we have to say. It is quite enlightening and empowering to be in a room with people who actually are interested in what we have to say. And obviously the more information, the more different stories you get, you will build up a picture. For some people it's mental health issues, for other people it's personal loss, and of course it's all very, very individual stories. On a personal level, I think, gradually things are improving. I'm not mentally grading sharp objects on a scale of 1 to 10 anymore, shall we say. So that's definite improvement. So, but thank you, and thank you very much all for listening.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we'll take a break until 5 to 12.
Thank you.
5 to 12.